So who could have built a structure like this? Could it be Satan? So this is called the Allée Couvert Von Blanc, the covered alley Von Blanc. But it's not, I don't know why they call it that. It's also called like Hunnebad or something like that, which is like the Dutch name for it. It's a different type of dolmen, but it's not quite a covered alley. What's the difference? I don't really know. This wasn't found like this. This has been reconstructed. I mean, all the pieces are original, but it's been propped up back into place. These are the same type of stones that they would make stone tools out of. But sometimes they would also make structures out of them too. So this was another type of tomb. I mean, nobody knows why some of them were more elaborate than others. It might have just been with how many rocks were available nearby. This site almost seems like it was like a combination of the two types of structure of a covered alley and a dolmen, because it still has like the shape of the covered alley, but the height of a dolmen. Now, I guess you could imagine that if you just stumbled upon something like this, even if it wasn't propped up exactly like this, you would be like, who on earth put this here, and how, and why? Well, people in medieval times, it just didn't occur to them that people could have made something like this, which doesn't really make any sense because they were building cathedrals, which are made of stone. I think this is what happens though when collective memory gets lost. Because when it doesn't look like any type of structure that you've ever seen before or that people are still building, and you can't really come up with any explanation for how it got here, I guess the only explanation they could come up with was that it just fell out of the sky or demons did it. And again, this has been like put back together. It would have been more of a ruin like the other covered alley that we saw. Even though the people who built these structures were long gone, the people who lived around these structures still used them for things. They would use them for pagan rituals. They would use them for fertility purposes. Sometimes the people would create legends about these sites in order to incorporate them into how they thought the world worked. So one of the local stories about this particular structure is that the Virgin Mary actually built it to shelter a young shepherdess from a storm. So sometimes people would just make up stories to make it fit into their worldview because they had no idea why they were really here. And people would continue to use them for ceremonial purposes and pagan rituals and things like that, and that really upset the Catholic Church. And
it's weird there's no other rocks around here.
The Neolithic farmers were obviously farmers, so you need to clear your fields in order to be able to plant crops. And so they probably moved a lot of rocks out of their fields and would gather them together and like, well, let's prop them up. I mean, maybe it could just be as simple as that. I mean, not everything has to be done for some kind of like higher cosmic purpose.
So it's like a Neolithic sofa cushion fort.
Yeah, I guess so.
Okay.
And then it's like, oh, well, let's bury Grandpa here. Okay, so do you think in order to lift it on top of these vertical pieces that they probably built a ramp?
They probably built a ramp. The whole thing was probably full of dirt.
Yeah. Oh, and then also remember this thing is going to be covered in dirt.
Right.
It's not now. Yeah, it's a little hard for us to imagine now, but most of these were covered in dirt. It's hard to find ones though that are still covered, but there are some around. We're going to go see one. But most of them have been excavated and they've been reassembled. Because usually if you come across one that hasn't been reassembled, it's just like a pile of rocks. But then they would excavate them and find, bodies and other artifacts.
And is that how they date them, by the dating of the bodies they find?
Bodies, okay. Yeah. Or maybe if they find some kind of a tool or something, they can date it from that. Not an original sign. I think they had signs up, like for the dolmens. Well, it's another beautiful megalithic day. Here we are at the covered alley of Dordogne, also known as a passage grave. And you can see, as opposed to your typical dolmen that's really quite simple, this one is a little more elaborate. It has more stones, it's longer. This one has not really been restored in any way. That's something you have to keep in mind when you see a lot of megalithic sites, that they're not how they looked when they were found. They were a lot more collapsed, more ruins. A lot of them have been propped up, and some of them they've even made concrete pieces to sort of replace the orthostats. This one's very rough. So this structure is obviously a lot more elaborate than the Dolmen de Bonarme that we saw. You've got, obviously, this stone was lifted into place and placed on these. This giant stone was obviously lifted somehow and placed on top of these, and it looks like one down here is collapsed. These stones have obviously not been shaped, not been polished, not been cut. These are very rough.
So I'm assuming these rocks were all deposited here in general and things just got moved around.
There are some stones that were quarried to make megalithic structures, but they know that a lot of them probably were just glacial erratics that were just moved. So these were used as graves. We don't know how someone was selected to be buried in one of these, because clearly not everybody was, or we would find a lot more bodies in them.
Did they ever find more than one set of remains under one dolmen?
Yes. There's a Neolithic culture in Germany called the Einzelgrabkultur, and means single grave culture. And those would be sort of like a little covered alley like this, but smaller, and there would be one grave in it. Yeah, sometimes there are multiple people's remains found here, and sometimes they find other artifacts, but not much. It's not like you're going to find like, they're not like these rich Celtic burials full of gold and things like that, because they didn't really have anything permanent back then. Everything they had was made of organic materials and stone. So anything that's wooden is going to rot. So it's very rare that we find wooden artifacts from the Neolithic, although we do have wooden artifacts. The Germans seem to be better at finding wooden artifacts preserved in the mud.
That's where all those spears that...
like the Schöningen spears. Now this dolmen, I'm not going to get any closer to this because they tell you not to, because this one is under study and under restoration. But this is right next to the Dordogne covered alley, and this kind of gives you an idea of what some of these sites look like when they're found, because they're so old. Trees have grown through them and broken them up and caused a lot of damage, and the stones have just been scattered over the years from all these constant cycles of freezing and thawing over 5,000 years. So this one's a real mess. If you don't know what you're looking for, you would just think that this was a pile of rocks, but it was actually deliberately arranged. But you can sort of see how it's like the covered alley in a disassembled form. I mean, you can see how there's a couple of large top pieces, and then some smaller vertical pieces that make sort of an alley.
Do you think that those alleys were covered at some point? Like that they had
they're usually
okay.
The whole thing is covered in a covered alley.
Okay.
And you can see in the drawing there, that's sort of the little drawing of how it is. And so you can kind of see the structure. You see how it's, there's these big rocks and then the smaller vertical rocks. But yeah, these things are they're just everywhere. They're just in the woods, in the fields, on hillsides. And they really weren't studied until, the past couple hundred years. People just really had no conception over who could have purposely built stones like this and why. But people were building them all over Europe for around 3,000 years. If you'd like to know more about this era, I have some affiliate links in the descriptions for some books that I enjoy. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos about history and travel. You can follow me on Instagram at Prehistoric Taurus and Around the World with Erin, and have a megalithic day!